Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another time of Bible study together as we're going through our Matthew study. We're moving on into Matthew chapter 20, but before going into that section, just one final point from Matthew 19 on this section here where Jesus is discussing about receiving an hundredfold. Verse 29, everyone that hath forsaken houses or brethren or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive an hundredfold and shall inherit everlasting life. What we're wanting to do is we're wanting to look at an example of this. What does this actually look like? Now, as I mentioned last time, most of these individuals in the first century who are actually having to go through this kind of activity did not receive most of this back physically. They did not regain any land. They did not regain any houses. But when we're considering these points here about brethren, sisters, fathers, mothers, wives, or even children, many of these people had to forsake these, and many of these people had them taken from them. As you're considering the persecutions and what James writes about how pure religion in the sight of God is to visit the fatherless and the widows, many of these individuals, these children, would have been made orphans because of the persecution that's being brought upon their parents as being Christians. Many of those widows became widows because their husbands are being murdered because they were in fact Christians. But when we're considering this point, that you shall receive an hundredfold, but on top of that you're going to inherit everlasting life, then in fact these elements could be what keeps you from inheriting everlasting life, as was being discussed with the rich young ruler and what it was that was keeping him from being able to receive these things. So when we're considering this point, you may get something here, but that's not where we are laying up our treasures. We discussed that. So we have this section discussing just a repeating of what Jesus taught in Matthew 6:33. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. But we have another example of this. When we consider the life of Paul, Paul is a great example of, number one, forsaking all these things, and then asking the question, okay, Paul, what did you get back in return? If you remember in Philippians 3, 7 through 8, Paul mentions, but what things were gained to me in the flesh, those fleshly things, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I counted all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. What is it that Paul won? What have you gotten back? A hundredfold, or as Luke records it, manifold blessings. A quick read of Romans chapter 16 will illuminate this for us. I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister. So you see, Jesus said, if you will forsake mother, father, wife, children, brethren, sisters, and Paul was willing to do that. And look at what he gained in return. He might have had to forsake a physical sibling, but he got a spiritual sibling in return. I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, which is a servant of the church, which is at Cenchrea, that you receive her in the Lord as become a saint, that ye assist her in whatsoever business she hath need of you, for she hath been a succorer of many, and of myself also. Paul, what are you getting out of this? Paul is writing to these brethren, and he's writing to us, and he says, I am getting a hundredfold. I might have had to turn my back on those physical elements that caused me to prosper so greatly, and that support system that I had under the Jewish system. But look at what he's getting in return. And not only him, but it says of Phoebe, she was a succor of many, and not just only Paul. Notice also 3 and 4 of Priscilla and Aquila. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my helpers in Christ Jesus, who have for my life laid down their own necks, unto whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. How much would it cost? Like, just try to think of an amount. What would be the price of a friend like this? And not only one friend, you got Priscilla and Aquila. They're not only helpers in Christ Jesus, but they laid down their own necks on the part of Paul, on his behalf. What would you give to have something like this? Wouldn't you say that this is getting a hundredfold? manifold blessings and then having eternal life? I had a teacher in preaching school, and he said that he never had to become a millionaire as long as he knew of brethren that were millionaires. And that's exactly what Paul is illustrating. That even though he is laying aside all these earthly, materialistic, fleshly interests, that there are going to be those that are going to help in return. And thus, that is what Christianity is offering for everybody. Verse 5 of Romans chapter 16. Likewise, greet the church that is in their house. Salute my well-beloved Epaenetus, who is the first fruits of Achaia unto Christ. Greet Mary, who bestowed much labor on us. Salute Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles who also were in Christ before me. Just view what you get if you're willing to forsake father, mother, wife, children, and lands. Greet the church that is in their house, who is the first fruits of Achaia. Greet Mary, who bestowed much labor on us. Here's somebody who is laboring with them and helping them. Andronicus and Junia. Not only are they brethren, but notice, my fellow prisoners. They were willing to go to prison with Paul. Look at the manifold blessings that we have, that we get in following Christ. Many would say, well, I cannot give them up their blood. This is my physical family. If that's the way you're going to be and that's how you're going to think, then you're going to miss out. You are going to miss out on the blessings. The requirement, so as to be able to gain these type of things, is you have to be willing to sacrifice these others. So we're right back in Matthew chapter 16, that if anyone is going to be a disciple, a follower of Christ, then they must take up their cross daily and follow him. What's the cost? Here's the cost. Well, what's the reward? What's the payout? It's worth it. So when we originally recorded this, we had my relatives in, and my mother-in-law was in Bible class with us. So I was really glad that she was with us as we're going through this illustration of making sacrifices so as to, consider what it is that you're able to gain. My in-laws, the Sword family, they lived in Ukraine for over 20 years. I think they did mission work for around 25 years. And here they are. They left their homeland, left their family, physical family behind. And in the early stages of going over there to do mission work, they left many of the comforts and conveniences of life that people here in the United States that they've enjoyed. And while my mother-in-law was with us, I asked her in class, what have you gotten in return? And her response, I didn't have to goad, didn't have to push her. Her response was 100-fold. But if we are wanting to receive these type of blessings, these type of dividends that come back on our investments, you first have to be willing to invest, which means you've got to be willing to make sacrifice. But even with that, when we're considering, those type of points, this isn't something that we can reach a point in our life and say, okay, well, I've made my sacrifices. I do not have to make any more sacrifices. Well, do you want to receive any more rewards? Are you wanting the manifold blessings, the 100-fold blessings to continue to come in? Well, then continue to make sacrifice. But when we're considering from that standpoint, the idea of what the payout is it really a sacrifice? We keep using this term in front of it, but when we're thinking about what is going to be coming in return, then we shouldn't really even be viewing it as a sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice. This is easy. Let me do it. And even in just considering my own life, Micah, what have you gotten since having to forsake the work in Virginia, leaving behind my physical family, leaving behind the work that I was involved in there? I lost a lot of my possessions. I've gotten 100-fold. Being here with good brethren in Montana that are helping us, being here with my wife and the home that we now have, everything is just coming back. But you have to be willing to go through the sacrifices at first. And it's difficult and it's scary. And we're seeing that in the life of the apostles. But what he's illustrating to them, or trying to have illustrated to them, is that we must have a proper attitude and view toward the material things of this life. There must be a radical change of mind towards these things. And thus, that's what Jesus was teaching about, you that follow me in the regeneration. So this is where the real crunch comes in, is when it comes to the physical things that I have around me. Would I be willing to walk away from them at any moment? And am I willing to use them, just like with the rich young ruler, am I willing to sell them and use them to the good of others? Am I willing to use what I have so as to help people that are in need? And when it comes to this difficult teaching, we need God's help on these matters. Now, I'm not saying anything miraculous. Nothing miraculous happened with the rich young ruler. Jesus said, you sell what you have and give it to the poor. That was on him. The same as with us. What we are learning with the rich young ruler, that is God trying to help us in battling covetousness, materialism, and dealing with these physical things of life. And so just an example of how that I even struggle with this. Just the other day, I was telling Jordan about a Dodge Caravan that popped up on Facebook for sale. We have a Dodge Caravan. It's a couple years newer than ours, has leather interior and all the bells and whistles, and I wanted that. I mean, to the degree that I was talking about possibly selling the van that we have now so as to get that new van. But just a few days ago, and probably as I was putting this class together, I just stopped and asked myself, but why? What's wrong with the van that I have? Really nothing. It's got some cosmetic things that need to be fixed, but there's really nothing wrong with the van that we have. So what is that? It's materialism. It's covetousness. Well, this is a bit more luxurious. Well, who really cares? What does that really do for you? Well, nothing. And then we got the van so that we can put children in it. Do I really want children throwing up on leather seats? No, I don't really think that I do. So we'll keep the van that we have. And all of that is, in view of, and also it's in the shadow of the sermon that Jordan just presented a couple weeks ago, right after Thanksgiving, about being thankful, being content. Here, Jordan just presented a really good sermon on be thankful for what you have, be content with what you have. And I'm doing this, this Bible class on materialism and physical things and making sure you have a proper view. And what pops up in between the week from his sermon to the week of this class? Materialism for me. But what helped? Well, God, it wasn't a small, still voice. God didn't talk to me and say, no, Micah, just be thankful for what you have. He did not do that directly. But in studying his word and remembering what Jordan presented, God helped. His word helped. And that's what we're trying to do with our Bible classes, with our assemblies, and just Christianity in general. Making sure that everybody is working on these different elements of our lives. And thus, where Jesus ends up presenting, but many that are first shall be last, and last shall be first. When it comes to these material things of life, they are going to be such a struggle for us that here comes like we said, the crunch of it. That your material things can actually end up putting you in a position to where you will be last. And that you can actually end up being lost eternally because of it. The rich young ruler struggled with this. And Jesus had to watch him walk away. And the apostles are there, and they had to watch this young man walk away, and they could not understand why he would walk away. He was upright. He had material possessions. He had prestige, and yet Jesus said, you need to get your life in order. And Jesus said, I will help. Now, you notice the help was very difficult. Christianity is difficult. And the young man would not do it. We need to teach our children early that life is not about the material things. How, this young man might have been different if someone had taught him early on, you know what, you have physical blessings, but that's not what's going to make you great. That's not what's going to bring you purpose. But this amplifies what was taught on the Mount as well. The contrast between those things and the general attitude of the world. And the people that are first are the ones who follow those attitudes. And the first one is poor in spirit, realizing the need that you have. So the struggle that the apostles are having is the same struggle that we're having today. What establishes one as being great? What establishes one as being blessed of God? They looked at this man and said, well, he's got all these physical possessions. He must be blessed of God. That's not what determines blessings. There are atheists around us that are very wealthy, and they're very blessed materially. But that doesn't mean that God's pleased with their style of living. So Jesus gives a parable in Matthew chapter 20, the parable of the laborers. We have another parable to teach about how we receive God's blessings. And Jesus is going to point out a crucial element that's involved with God's grace. That in fact, it's not by merit. But even though it's not by merit, that does not mean that it is without any labor or that it's without any work. I need to pull up my Bible program here so that we can read this parable together before we actually go through a breakdown of it. And while that's booting up, I can actually just go ahead and read it from my Bible that I have in front of me. Nope, here it comes. Bear with me. There we go. All right. And then, so I need to go over here, make sure everything is adjusted properly. Forgot about this element. There we go. That looks pretty good. Okay, Matthew chapter 20. All right, here's our parable. For the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and said unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right I will give you. And they went their way. Again he went out about the 6th and 9th hour, and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all the day idle? They say unto him, Because no man hath hired us. He saith unto them, Go ye also into the vineyard, and whatsoever is right, that shall ye receive. So when even was come, the Lord of the vineyard saith unto his steward, Call the laborers, give them their hire, beginning from the last unto the first. And when they came that were hired about the 11th hour, they received every man a penny. But when the first came, they supposed that they should have received more. And they likewise received every man a penny. And when they had received it, they murmured against the goodman of the house, saying, These last have wrought but 1 hour, and thou hast made them equal unto us, which have borne the burden and heat of the day. But he answered one of them and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst not thou agree with me for a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way. I will give unto this last, even as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil, because I am good? Now that's an important phrase that we're going to break down here in a little bit. And again, he states, as was mentioned in Matthew 19 and verse 30, so all of this is connected. So the last shall be first, and the first last. For many be called, but few chosen. Now, after that reading, it should become fairly apparent as to what it is that we're going to be looking at. When we are considering how it is that God is going to bless people, it's not based upon any individual's standing, that it is simply by his goodness. Now, the thrust of the parable can be found in these two verses. The first one is in verse 6. About the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle, and saith unto them, Why stand ye here all the day idle? Why are they standing there idle? Because no one has hired them. Why is nobody hiring them? These are the little forgotten people. So we're right back in Matthew chapter 18. Despise not these little ones. The Jews, the apostles, are constantly in this business of trying to gauge people. Where are they on a scale? Well, here's this rich young ruler, and he's way up here on the scale. But what about a leper? What about a woman with an issue of blood? What about a blind man? What about a Roman centurion? Well, they're down here on the scale. And Jesus is illustrating. He has been illustrating throughout all of his, not only his teaching, but also his practices. You do not gauge people like this. And here's the illustration. Here's the parable. The second verse is in verse 15, where in the parable, the householder raises the question, and he asked, is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? He's the householder. It's his land. He's the one hiring people. So who gets to determine? Who is in control of this? Who has the authority to dictate what's going to happen? It's the householder. Is thine eye evil because I am good? So the illustration of this, the point of this is that all of this is focusing on the goodness of God. The blessing or the blessings that are being provided are not by man's merit, but purely by his grace. Now, do not confuse the conditions that God puts on this situation as being conditions to our merit. That's not what's happening here. But the parable teaches how at this time there's no confusion on this point. The apostles understand it. They do not ask for any explanation, so neither should we. It's pretty simple, pretty plain as to what's going on here. That it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, and even for that matter, how long you've been a Christian. That does not make you more deserving of God's blessings, God's grace, and eternal life than anybody else. I do not get to look at my life and say, well, I'm the son of a preacher, been involved in working in the kingdom, preaching, doing live television and evangelism, tent meetings, and all this kind of stuff. I've been doing this for all this time. And thus that makes me better than, say, a person who obeys the gospel just a year ago. That I'm more deserving of what God has than that person. No, friends. But that's what ends up happening inside the Lord's church. And when we're considering this information, that's how we need to look at it. This is not written to denominational people. This is not written to worldly people. This is being spoken to Jews, people in covenant with God. And what were they doing? They were looking at the things that they had been involved in and saying, well, yeah, we deserve to be blessed. Those that worked all day long, what they did not earn the blessing. And here's the problem. So when we're considering this from the aspect of denominationalism, what is happening here goes beyond what they did at their hiring and the work that was being given to them to do. When you go to the very beginning of this event and that the householder went out and called laborers, why would he do that? Had they done anything to deserve his calling them to go and work? No, they're just there. Especially the idle people. They're just standing around not doing anything. What had they done to deserve the householder's calling? Nothing. There's the start. You were called based upon no goodness of your own. And so the last thing that you need to do is that you need to start thinking while you're in the midst of your work, well, yeah, I deserve this. No. Go back to the very beginning. You were undeserving. The ones at the 11th hour, they were not being rewarded by their neglect, but purely by God's grace in this situation. Now, just think about this. Someone reaches old age, and if they've been in service in the kingdom of God for a long time, and then here's somebody, and they obey the gospel, and then 2 months later, they end up dying. Just 2 months being spent in service compared to many, many years. Can the early servant, this person, complain that the new servant will go to heaven? Now, in our Bible class on Sunday, somebody actually answered this correctly. They said, well, they can, but they shouldn't. And that's 100% right. Why should I think that I served longer than you, and therefore I have more right to heaven than you do? I shouldn't. It happens, but I should not do that. None of us have any right to heaven. Well, Mike, I've been doing this in the kingdom and this in the kingdom. And no, stop. You have no right to heaven. God's goodness makes heaven available to all. Now, it's available to all, but the only ones that are going to get there are the ones that are going to answer the call and that are going to do the things that God wants them to do. And that is the crux of the matter. That's kind of the catch-22 of the situation. So here's the problem of the day. The Jews had the idea that what they did earned God's blessings, that somehow they ended up having a monopoly on God's blessings. Well, it's just over here for us and it's not there for anybody else. Jesus points that out and says, no, that's not true. And the Pharisees thought of themselves as being way up here because they were so separated from everybody else. But just as we're studying, as we're mentioning, we can get into this mindset also. But when we're considering the Jews and what they're involved in their religious system, what should all of those things that God has them do, the Jews, remind them of? Just think about everything that God commanded them to do. Here's what you do. You observe this, you observe this, you observe this feast day and this feast day, so on and so forth. What is all of that designed to do? What did the Old Testament sacrifice remind a person about themselves? Sins that they had committed. I am killing this animal because of sin that I've committed. And then you want to turn around and say, well, I offered this sacrifice, so therefore God deserves, or I deserve God's blessings. God owes this to me. No, he does not. He could have just left you in your sin and let you get what you really deserve, which is death. But grace stepped in and said, I'm not going to kill you. Here's what you can do instead. You can offer this sacrifice in your place, and I will spare you. But the Jews had so manipulated that they started building themselves up off of the fact of, well, I'm obeying what God says, so therefore I'm deserving. No, you're not. So for us today, when I sing songs about heaven and the reward that awaits those that will be faithful and the redemption that has been brought down to earth, when I'm singing about God's blessings, when I sing about Jesus and his sacrifice, what does all of that remind me of? When I take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, every Sunday, what am I being reminded of? When I give, when I make a sacrifice, and that I'm sacrificing in view of the sacrifice that Jesus made for me, and when I pray during the partaking of the Lord's Supper and before we give, and the opening prayer and the closing prayer, what is it that is supposed to remind all of us of? Sins that we have committed. That I am not worthy. I am not deserving of any of this. And even though I obey God's commands, even though I do all of the things that God commands me to do on the first day of the week, and then when I come home, when it comes to how I treat my wife, how I treat my brethren, how I treat people in the community, hey, I'm following all of that. I am not one step closer to earning anything from him. And that's the dangerous ground of all of this. That, yeah, we can start looking at, well, yeah, I'm doing this and I'm doing that, so therefore I'm a shoo-in for heaven. No, that's not what that is. I'm able to go to heaven because of what God has offered. And he said, okay, here's what I'm offering. If you want it, here's what you need to do. And then I was not deserving of that offer. I cannot then take that offer and then start waving it around and saying, okay, yeah, I deserve it. If that's how you're going to be, you're setting yourself up for failure. And that's what Jesus is trying to nip in the bud with the apostles. Nobody is deserving of this. So that's why the last end up being paid like the rest. The apostles are there, and they're trying to figure it out. The ones that were hired at the beginning, they come and they ask, why is this being done? And it's because simply of grace. And especially this point right here that Jesus uses in the illustration. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Salvation belongs to God. It's his. he can do with it whatever he wants. He can put whatever conditions on salvation that he desires. God created and gave the plan of salvation, not man. So how I think it should go has nothing to do with it. And that's the problem that we're facing in the religious world. God has granted salvation. And here is how God says salvation is granted. And then man wants to turn around and say, "Nah, I don't think you should go that way. That seems complicated." Is it not lawful for God to do with his what he will? They would say, well, this method excludes, this class of people. I wouldn't do it that way. Is it not lawful for God to do what he wills with what is his? Well, I think it should be done like this. See the answer above. The call is made. Will you answer the call as it is given by God? And will you do what the call says? He went out, found laborers, and said, "Hey, go work." Will you do that? And will you do it for the reward that he says? Or will you get involved in it and start looking at it from the standpoint of, well, I deserve better, and then you start making demands on God? And that's what we have going on in the religious world. The denominational world, that is at the center of it. They're trying to make demands of God because they feel as though they are deserving. And for us in the churches of Christ, that we're just simply saying, hey, here's what the Bible says, just do that. That's not me trying to act any type of way. That's me being a humble servant. Hey, just do what the master says. And be happy, be pleased with what it is that you get. In which, of course, the reward is the same for everybody. Now, here's the other issue of this. Why is it that people would start doing that with what God has said? Is thine eye evil? Because I am good. What would cause a person to think and to act this way towards God? Then here you are being blessed, you're receiving a reward, and here's somebody else who's receiving a reward with you, but you're angry, indignant, hostile towards this other person who's being rewarded just like you are. It's an evil eye. And how is it that you then end up viewing the goodness of God? You end up viewing his goodness as being evil. If my eye is evil, how will I start viewing the goodness of God? I will start seeing it as darkness. I will hate and I will despise God's goodness. So with this, we're right back in Matthew 6:22 and 23. This is inspired commentary on what Jesus said here. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? Friends, brethren, this is a dangerous place to be. That we start viewing the goodness of God and we see it as darkness. That's what's happening with these laborers. You were not deserving of the call. The call came out and you answered. And you're going to be rewarded. And here's somebody that's been idle. And they get the call. And they answer. And they're going to be rewarded the same way that you're going to be rewarded. And you cannot be happy for them. There's not anything wrong with the call. There's nothing wrong with the work. There's something wrong with you. And what we're studying in Matthew chapter 20 is going to come into play when you study the parable, the parable of the prodigal son. That you have that brother who stayed home. And when his younger brother, who they thought was dead, came back and they found out that he's alive and that he's repenting, how does the older brother behave? How does he act when he sees the goodness of his father being bestowed upon somebody that was despised in his eyes? He didn't view it as goodness. He saw it as darkness. This kind of stuff goes on inside the Lord's church too. You have preachers that are hating on other preachers because of good things that are happening to them. Something wrong with your eye. Members of the congregation, brethren, sisters, hating on each other because somebody's doing better than they are. Something wrong with your eye. Why can't you rejoice with them? Why can't you be happy that something good is happening for them? And that's exactly what Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Or rather, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when discussing the different members of the body. When one rejoices, we are all supposed to rejoice. I'm supposed to be happy for you because good things are happening to you. And when you mourn, I'm supposed to mourn with you. But guess what happens in this type of situation? If you are a person that has this problem with your eye, that you're engaging people in this wrong way, when they rejoice, you will mourn. And what was it that Paul said about mourning? If a brother or sister mourns, we all mourn. If you are not looking at this the right way, when they rejoice, you will mourn. And when they mourn, you will rejoice. And brethren, that's contrary to how we're supposed to be. You're not going to go to heaven that way. Envy and jealousy is what Jesus is discussing here. Is thine eye evil because I am good? If thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. And we have an Old Testament illustration of this too. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 9. Saul, look at this, eyed David from that day forward. David is serving the king as he should. David is just doing everything that's good for him to do. And he's getting recognition. The people are rejoicing and they're singing his praises, and they're singing praises of David higher than that of Saul. And instead of Saul being happy for David and rejoicing with the rest of the people at David's accomplishments, look at what it says of Saul. Saul eyed him. He envied David. So Jesus is saying to the Jews, and he's saying to us, do you envy the little and despised who enjoy my blessings also? When you should be happy for these people that are living in sin, but now they're getting their lives together. They're getting their lives in order. They're not just getting their lives in order, but they're becoming righteous like you. Whoa, hold on a second, Jesus. They're not on the same level as I am. I've been doing all these things, so on and so forth. And that's what made the Pharisees so upset when they saw Jesus sitting with publicans and harlots, when he was eating with sinners. What was the mindset of the Pharisees? Oh, they can't get on our level. But Jesus is showing that's not what's going on in the kingdom of Christ. That's not what's going on in the church. Oh, but that stuff goes on. Politics, these type of games, oh, they're happening all over the place. It causes division. And it causes schisms inside of the body. Verse 16, so the last shall be first and the first last. For many be called, but few chosen. Here it is. What makes the difference? That many can be called, but few will be chosen. We've already seen this back in Matthew 7 and 13 and 14, discussing the straight gate and the wide gate. Enter ye in at the straight, the difficult gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. And look at this. And many there be which go in thereat. There's your many. How is it that many are called, but only few are chosen because of the way they're going to go? The attitudes that they're going to follow. You see Matthew 7, we're still on the Mount. This is Sermon of the Mount material. The many that will go into the broad gate that leads to destruction are the ones that will not take on the Beatitudes. Because straight is the gate, narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. The call goes out throughout the whole world. So why are few being chosen? It's Matthew 5-7 and those attitudes. These are not optional. The Beatitudes are demanded. They are essential. And it's those things which separates people. Why would the Pharisees, Sadducees, not follow Christ? Because they couldn't humble themselves. Why are the apostles facing the troubles that they're facing? Because they would not humble, they couldn't, or they would not humble themselves as they needed to. And he's giving this illustration to his apostles. And this is going to be very important when we're considering this from the standpoint of who's going to end up coming into the picture later. Here are the 12. They're going to lose Judas. In Acts chapter 1, there's the choosing of a new apostle. And guess what could very likely be the mentality towards Matthias? Okay, Matthias, you weren't part of the original group. You're coming in later, so you're technically not on the same level with the rest of us. But you don't see that happen. Why? There's that drastic change. There is that radical change in the thinking of the apostles. And we have seen it happen already in the lives of the apostles right here in this time when John brings the question about, well, Jesus, there's this one guy out here and he was performing miracles, but we told him to stop because he's not with us. Aha, you see there? All these things are being illustrated right before our very eyes. Why are they doing that? Because of this right here. You think you're better than him. But why? You're not. Is he involved in the same work that we're doing? Is he teaching the same things that we're doing? Yes. Then don't despise him just because he's not part of your group. Just think about if Matthias had been chosen, let's say something had happened to Judas earlier, he's removed, and then Jesus called Matthias in. How do you think the apostles would have started looking at Matthias? Okay, there's the low man. There's the guy on the bottom of the totem pole. We'll make him do all the hard stuff. I can just picture it. But thankfully, with God's help at the teaching that's going on right here, when it came time to choose Matthias, they did not treat him that way. Saul, who becomes the Apostle Paul. If that radical change had not taken place here, how would they have been treating Paul? Okay, Paul, you're not part of the original group. Yeah, we'll let you go out here and do these things, but you're not on our level. They didn't do that. Now, they were afraid of Paul, and rightfully so, because he was killing Christians. But once they found out, hey, yeah, he really has been converted, he's turned over a new leaf, how do they treat Paul? Paul, you're one of us. That radical change. So when we end up bringing people in, we end up helping people convert. We do not need to start treating them as, well, hey, you're down on this low level and you got to work your way up. No, none of that. We're laborers together. We've been called to the same work. We're going to get the same reward. And it's this element that kills congregations. Why are congregations not willing to grow? Because they got this select group of people, and it's us. And if you get brought in, you're not one of us yet. You got to build your way up to being one of us. And that's shameful. But it happens because we still want to think this way. Then, in the midst of this discussion, and Jesus going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples apart in the way and said unto them. Now, this is important in the laying out of how these things are recorded because of what's going to happen next. We just had this parable about the laborers. Doesn't matter how long that you've been involved in the work, you're going to get the same reward. Now Jesus discusses his crucifixion and his resurrection. Jesus going up to Jerusalem took the 12 disciples apart in the way and said unto them, Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock, to scourge, to crucify him, and the third day he shall rise again. Now again, we are studying the difficulty of properly understanding the cross. We talked about it in Matthew 16. We're going to talk about it here again because the apostles are still struggling on what the cross is actually meaning, and we struggle with it too. Now, when you have time, I would encourage you to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all the accounts and all the times that Jesus mentions his cross, the crucifixion, and really pay attention to the response that the apostles give back every time. And we are able to view just how hard it is to get the right impression of what is happening. So Jesus just said everybody's going to get the same reward. Nobody's going to be above anybody else. And here comes two of the apostles, and they still just don't get it. Matthew 20, verse 20. Then came to him the mother of Zebedee's children with her sons, worshiping him and desiring a certain thing of him. He said unto her, What wilt thou? She saith unto him, Grant that these my two sons may sit, the one on thy right hand, the other on thy left, in the kingdom. Now, this underlined phrase is very important for us to consider. 2 times, Jesus will ask this question of somebody. Once is right here. It's going to happen again in this chapter. And there's a contrast between why Jesus asked this question of the two different people, 2 different classes of people. Here's the mother of Zebedee's children. She has a desire. Jesus says, okay, what do you want? What can I do for you? And the answer is going to be different because of the attitudes of the people that are asking and what they're asking for. So this is a good question that we should be asking, that Jesus asked her. He asked her, what do you want? Well, I need to be asking myself that question about life. What is it that I want? What thing am I wanting more than anything else? And what determines that is by what we desire. We go in the direction of our desires. Jesus presented it in Matthew chapter 6 in the phrase, where your heart is, there will your treasure be. Where's my heart? What are my desires? What is it that I'm treasuring? And we can determine, we can gauge where a person's going to go based upon what it is that they are desiring. Now we're right here in the midst of this discussion about material things, covetousness. That was the rich young ruler's problem. Where was his desire? His desire was on earthly things. Where did that lead him? Where did he go? He went towards material things. I can look at a person's life, and I can tell where your desires are by where you're spending your time, where you're putting the majority of your effort. And we have brethren, I know of some brethren, that, yeah, they have a lot of things. They have a lot of material possessions. But that's not their desire. You want to know how I know it? Because majority of it they put towards the work of the kingdom. It's not just theirs. They're willing to dispense of it, disperse of it. I know of a few millionaires inside of the Lord's church. But their desires are not set on their riches because of how freely they give. But I know of some other brethren, man, they've got businesses, they've got lands, and they've got a multitude of possessions. But they don't dispense of it. And in fact, they spend more time involved in those things, caring about those things, than they'd actually spend on the kingdom. There's your desire. Now, this goes all the way back to the beginning, Genesis 3, in the temptation of Eve. How was it that she was led off into the direction that she went when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was pleasant to the eyes and a tree to be desired? And there she went. Our desires lead us. And the gospel is designed so as to morph and to change our desires and to change what we live for. We are to be regenerated. And Jesus has illustrated that with the parable. Not only with the parable, but even with his own life. What was it? What was Christ's desires? What was his desire here on earth? To do the will of the Father. And it showed in how he lived. The fruits were there. Notice what we have going on here. What wilt thou? What is your desire? She saith unto him, grant that these my two sons may sit the one on thy right hand and the other on the left in thy kingdom. This is the very problem that Jesus has been trying to battle against. Who is the greatest? And the apostles just aren't getting it. James and John pull their mother into their little scheme. Okay. See where they're going because of their desires? They want position. Jesus has just taught, no, everybody's going to get the same thing. He's already said in Matthew chapter 19 that you're going to sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes. You're all going to be sitting together. But you see, they still cannot be satisfied with that. Well, okay, yeah, we're all going to sit on the same thrones, but Jesus, who's going to be closer to you? Who's going to be on your right hand? Who's going to be on the left? They want to jump ahead. They're trying to jump ahead of everyone else. All this talk of a kingdom and that they will sit on thrones, so they try to get their thrones picked out first. Let's get our names in the hat first. But what Jesus what had Jesus already said about position? When we're thinking about positions already being given out, who's going to have the keys? Well, Peter's going to have the keys. Okay, that's position. And he did not ask for it. Jesus gave it to him. So they're all getting thrones. We see that's not good enough. We want to be on your right hand and on your left. See, that gives us more position than the others. Notice what Jesus says. 22 and 23. But Jesus answered and said, ye know not what you ask. They did not fully recognize and understand what they were jumping into. They are not understanding properly the nature of the kingdom, what it means to be in the kingdom, and what sitting on thrones actually means. And this is true. This statement, ye know not what you ask, is true of Christianity. Now, these are the apostles, and they're wanting to sit on thrones, but the same thing needs to be recognized when a person says, well, yeah, I want to become a Christian. I don't think you really understand what you're asking. You don't really understand what you're getting yourself into. And many people don't. Many people have a false view and idea of Christianity that, it's just this lackadaisical, lazy type of lifestyle. Nothing's really being demanded of me. I don't know. There's nothing I need to do. Works are condemned when it comes to receiving God's blessings. Not according to this parable. If you're going to be a Christian, you're going to have to work. Because God has said, okay, I'll give you a reward. I'll give you heaven. Come and work for me. Wow, what a blessing. Of course I will. But many people won't do that. I want to get baptized and, that's it. No, that's just the start. That's just one element of answering the call. Ye know not what ye ask. They are having the same problem that Peter had, saying too much too early. But Jesus answers, are ye able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of and to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? They say unto him, we are able. Oh, really? All right, Mr. Arrogant. Let's just see what you've got. The cup that I shall drink. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was praying to the Father, let this cup pass from me. He's discussing his suffering and his persecution. The baptism that he was going to be baptized with is suffering, persecution, and death. And here are these apostles, and they say, we're ready. But were they really? When Jesus is being led away and being taken to trial and having to carry his own cross and then finally being crucified and killed, where were the apostles? Majority of them were nowhere to be found. But yet here they are, and they're saying, oh yeah, we're ready. No. You don't understand what you're asking. He saith unto them, ye shall drink indeed of my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared of my Father. It shall be given to whom it is prepared. Places in the kingdom, in the church, are not portioned out. It shall be given as prepared of my Father. Well, for whom is it prepared, Jesus? Those who produce the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes do not produce a person to chase position. The Beatitudes produce a person who will chase the chance to serve others. In verse 24, and when the 10 heard it, they were moved with indignation against the two brethren. Here is what selfish attitudes produce. Indignation. Mark tells us, Mark 10:41, and when the 10 heard it, they began to be much displeased with James and John. See what this attitude of greatness, desiring to be great, and the wrong way to get it, what it does to brethren? Creates friction, produces schisms, brings about envy, jealousy, hatred. And this is not just true inside of the Lord's church, this is true in a home. You want problems with your children? Have this kind of stuff going on. Pushing for a position. Well, I'm going to be the better sibling. I'm going to be the better child than this person. You want problems in a marriage? Start playing this game of which spouse is greater. Well, I'm the husband, so I'm more important. Well, no, I'm the wife. I'm more important. This is what you're going to get from that. At work, in the community, doesn't matter where you are. Here's the issue. Trying to be great the wrong way. And Jesus explains why they're facing this problem and what's going to cure it. But Jesus called them unto him and said, ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. So he points to the world. See, he goes outside of Judaism, and he says, the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them. To exercise dominion, push people around, to be served by others. Now, if you really stop and consider this, this is a huge insult. That here's all of this discussion about how to be great, and these Jews are discussing it, and Jesus points to the Gentiles, and he says, here's how the Gentiles behave. Now look at yourselves. How are you acting? See right there? The apostles are no better than the Gentiles. Jews are no better than the Gentiles. You're involved in the same things. Because you're not following what the scriptures say. You're not following the teachings of God. Here's a huge slice of humble pie being given to the apostles. You are behaving just as the Gentiles are behaving. So what about this attitude of deserving? What about this attitude of, well, yeah, God owes me? No, he doesn't. Well, I'm better than this person. I'm better than that person. No, you're not. Here's how the Gentiles behave. They exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. They're on top. Everybody else is on the bottom. Here's the contrast. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Greatness is found in service. And what is it that leads one to service? Self-sacrifice. Humble yourself. Become as a little child. Remove selfish desires. Consider others. Have compassion for other people. And Jesus has been teaching this the whole time with his apostles, this 3-year journey that they are on. Jesus has been teaching this and practicing this before their very eyes. Now just think of how backwards this is to the world standard. That thrones are made for service. That's the opposite of everything this world believes. Oh, if you want to be great, you're going to climb the ladder, and it doesn't matter who you step over to get to the next rung. You do what you have to do. Jesus says, no. That's not how you're supposed to be. That if you really want to be great, you help people. And that's why, so you just look at this from the business aspect, that's why certain people inside of a company, yeah, they may climb the ladder and they may get to the top, but just because they're there in position doesn't mean that they are great, because you may get to the top and nobody wants to follow you. Why? Because of what you did to them so as to get there. So to be great in anything, great inside the church, great at home, great at work, great inside of the community, you got to help people on the way to the top. And when you help people get to the top with you, they'll be ready to follow. Throne, I mean, just consider it a throne that's being made for a slave. It's hard to believe. And our local politicians and our federal representatives are a great illustration of how not to be great. Our local politicians and those that are in Washington, D.C., they are in a position of leadership, greatness. What are they supposed to be doing with that? They're supposed to be serving us. But you see, they've forgotten this element. They've forgotten this point. They are there not to serve themselves, but that's exactly what they're doing. And that's the reason why our nation is crumbling. Who would ever dream that the cross would be the road to a throne? No one. Because that's not how the world thinks about greatness. But the cross was Christ's way to serve a lost and dying world. And he got a throne because of it. We today, if we want a throne, if we want a crown, the way to do it, the way to receive it, is through service. Labor in the kingdom. Verse 28, even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. The great example of this is right before their eyes. Just look, watch how the Son of God is behaving. He's not going around and just letting people throw parades for him everywhere that he goes. He doesn't go around and just let people minister to him. Oh, Jesus, let us feed you. Let's do this. Let's do that. No, he is doing everything for people. Can you imagine a king coming into a community somewhere and taking off his robe and getting down in the muck and the mire and helping the people dig ditches? That's what Jesus is doing. And in fact, what Jesus is presenting here, I have seen the opposite of that firsthand. In the Marshall Islands, where my family was involved in doing mission work, they still have a king. Now, similar to the royalty that's found in the British tradition, that they really don't have any type of power anymore. It's more just like a status symbol. But the Marshalls, it's a third world country. Majority of the people that live in these islands, their homes, their houses, it's a dirt floor, 4 pieces of plywood, and if you can find 10 so as to make a roof, you're doing really well. And majority of them still cook their food in a pit that's dug out in the floor. But how do you think the king lives, while the rest of his people live in poverty? Oh, the king lives well. And in fact, the king, he lived on the capital island, which is Majuro, and he lived on a complex. He lived with a gate around his house. But he also had a vacation home on one of the other islands that we had to be living on at the time, which was Guchigu. And guess how that house was? So not only did he have his house on the capital, but he had a vacation home. None of his people, none of his servants, subjects, they didn't have vacation homes. But the king did. And the second time that my family went to the Marshalls to do mission work, we actually arrived at the same time that the king was having his birthday. Jesus said, the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. Do you think kings, do you think our politicians live this way? That they're ministering to others? Do you think this king on this island, that he lived that kind of life? No. Here are his people, and they are living in poverty. And somehow they managed to throw him a birthday. And it was lavish. Fish, chicken. They had a pig, like luau style, cooked on a spit, apple in the mouth. And you're just sitting there and you're just looking at it, like, where did all of this come from? They don't have this stuff. And then in the midst of all the festivities, everybody that was there in attendance of the party lined up, went before the king's table, and then they put money in a basket for him. That's worldly greatness. Oh, you're exercising dominion. You have authority over these people. And they come and they minister to you. No, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's cruel. But that's how the world views greatness and power. But Jesus says that's not how it's going to be in the church, because the Son of God did not behave that way. Now, what is it that has polluted the apostles' vision of a throne and of a kingship? All their history with an earthly king in Israel. The problem that the apostles are having is coming way back in their family history to the days of Samuel. Samuel, we want a king like the rest of the nations. And God says, don't do it. Why? Because he won't serve you, he'll serve himself. And the apostles are looking at kings like David. Oh, he sat on a throne and he was wealthy. He had dominion. Solomon, he sat on the throne and he extended the borders of the kingdom even beyond what it was that God had even promised. And how the people came and bowed themselves before him. And they brought him gifts. The other kings, the king of Egypt, he came and bowed himself before David and Solomon. And the apostles are seeing that, and they're like, yeah, that's what we want when we sit on thrones. Jesus says, nope. So you see there again, friends and brethren, the decisions that we make now are going to have a lasting effect and a lasting impact on generations that will come. So be careful with what you decide to do while you're alive now. So even as the Son of Man, here are 2 principles: to minister and to give. My life must be concerned and given to the ministering of others. A life that gives and does not get. Our life is not just giving over a few dollars into a plate on Sunday. I must be willing to give of my whole self, all of it, and not just these isolated things. Well, yeah, here are these things that I'll give, I'll give these things, but over here, no, you can't touch these things. These things are mine. Nope. The Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give. To give what? How much? To give his life. And in the 2 Corinthians letter, 2 Corinthians 8, that's what Paul praises the Macedonians for, that even though they were in deep poverty, and yet they had a desire to want to give towards the poor saints in Jerusalem. Why? Paul says because they first gave themselves. They gave their whole life over to Christ. When we are considering this element, or that this parable and this teaching, all leadership is encapsulated in this. Realizing leadership is a place of service. What did the throne represent? The throne represented work. That you serve others with your position and your power. Effective elderships, effective preachers, and effective teachers begins and ends right here. Being great fishers of men to help save the souls of men. We have to minister and to give. It demonstrates a care for others. There's a saying that people do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. It's cliche, but it's true. We can go out and we can preach to people and teach people. Here's what God says that you need to do. That's exercising authority. That's trying to exercise dominion over people. But what changes that element is when, no, I'm not trying to exercise dominion. I'm not trying to have authority over you. I'm trying to minister. I'm trying to give to you the words of life. And that we literally, we seriously care for people. And we care for all people. The little people, the ones that are despised and would be pushed to the side of society. No, we want you too. Because the call has gone out. And the reward is there for people. Eternal life is available. I want you to have what I have. And that being the blessings of God. I'm not going to look at the goodness of God and see it as darkness. Well, I've got it and I don't want him to have it. No, I want him to have it too. And that's why we go out and minister. That is why we're to go out and to be evangelistic, to be fishers of men, to give our lives over so that they can know truly about what Christianity is and the blessings that come from it. We'll stop there at verse 28 and pick up verse 29 with the blind men that end up coming to follow Jesus. And again, the apostles are struggling with this principle. Do not despise these little ones. Do not push the children away. Do not start trying to gauge and jockey for position and start saying about people, hey, you don't belong here. You're not one of us. And another teaching opportunity is brought before them. So we look forward to having you back at that time of our study. We hope that you've enjoyed this study of the parable of the laborers here in Matthew chapter 20. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us through the different means that we have made available. And until the next time of our study, hope that you have a great rest of your day, and God bless.